Good evening, Dan. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome, everyone, all participants, to today's shiur, this evening, Thursday of Matos-Masei. We'll go straight to our first question. Last Friday, I got a call from a shliach who had prepared a big cholent for his Shabbos guests, and then realized that the potatoes are sourced from Eretz Yisroel. And then he realized Shiloh of Shemitah. That's besides the questions, well, if it wasn't Shemitah, then it'd be a problem of Trumas and Maestros. But here was a Shiloh of Shemitah. Now, I want to make this clear that Shemitah is meant to be eaten. The food, if Shemitah is there for everyone to be able to eat. However, so then that shouldn't have been a problem. Here there's another problem, and that is with sfichin. And that's only related to vegetables, not relating to fruit from a tree. So let's read this halacha in Rambam. I didn't bring it from the Shulchan Aruch because we don't have detailed halachas of Shemitah in Shulchan Aruch. So here we go. Medivrei Sofrim, sheyehu kol hasfichin asurin ba'achila. Midrabanon, they impose an isur on sfichin, which means if you have, last year you planted tomatoes, and this year tomatoes are growing. How do they grow? They grow by themselves, yeah? So that was sfichin in Yiddish, they use it translated wiederwuchs, the regrowth. And Chachamim saw that farmers were having very generous quantities of, it grew by itself. And because that was very, very suspicious. And they understood that there was some fishy stuff going on about it, and they made an issur on the types of things which you need to replant every year. And you say that they grew by itself, so that's got an issur sfichin. That's got an issur with Rabban. You're not allowed to eat it. So again, oranges, avocados, which grow during Shemitah, so they will have kedusha shvius. But vegetables which grow during Shemitah, not just that they have kedusha shvius, but there's a isur achila. Midrabon, you're not allowed to eat. And there, let's finish off this piece of Rambam. V'loma gozru aleihem. Why did the Chachamim forbid the eating of sfichin? Because of those who were violating the halacha. You shouldn't go and plant grain and beans and other garden vegetables. You'll do so discreetly. And when it grows, he'll say they just grew by itself. Therefore, the Chachamim forbade us to eat any of those kind of things which was listed if they grew on Shemitah. So the potatoes, well, as I'm saying, in addition to the issur of, well, so the din of kedusha shvius, which is one can handle, one can eat it, and just be careful with the peels, etc. Kedusha shvius is something which one can deal with, but sfichin is something which you cannot use. I'm not saying that you can go and buy Shemitah produce, as in oranges or avocados, from the supermarkets. You shouldn't be doing that. That's because of Chazak yedei over avera, not to. There's an issue to trade, and by us patronizing, So we are supporting the people who are the people who are not keeping Shemitah. But the actual fruit, if someone did buy avocados from Eretz Yisroel, they are kedusha spheres, so then you'd be allowed to eat them. By contrast, here, the case of the potatoes, there's Issa Rabbanon to have those potatoes. The potatoes were in a cholent, as I mentioned before. The cholent also had a chunk of meat, and unfortunately, I would say that you would not be able to eat the meat either, because it's got Issa Rabbanon mixed in with it. And the even I would say you'd have to kasher the pot. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Here, let's go. So here I had a conversation early in the week with someone who's going on holiday somewhere in England. I don't know exactly where. But this is taken from, I guess, from Google Maps or something. And if you want to look at the map, there's at the top here, where I think there's number 1. That's where his holiday home is. Number 2 is where he is, where there is a minyan. And he, during his holiday time there, he would love to join the minyan for Shabbos. The problem is of Tchum, and that is you're not allowed to walk 2,000 amas beyond your dwelling. And now in the inner city, it's not a problem because you can walk the whole town. But here it's very much in countryside. And so there's no houses. So it's only got a limit of 2,000 amas. And there's no direct, you can't walk through directly from as a crow flies because there's a field in the way. So there is a road which is pointing this line made of little balls. That's the road. Now, some time ago, I'd written an article and published it in the Tribune about walking from Boreham Wood to Edgware. And in that article, I had discussed the concept of alachsoin, that when you have you're allowed to walk 2,000 amas, that means 2,000 amas square. You can walk east 2,000 amas, and you can walk south 2,000 amas. You can also walk the diagonal of that square, which means another 40%, it's actually 2,800 amas. Now, this concept of alachsin comes up in 2 forms. One is when you're measuring the limits of a city for the Eruv, and so that the city is first measured and then squared, and you can walk beyond the city to the corners of the square. But then we have the individual who is somewhere in the sticks and now wants to walk 2,000 amas. So actually, he can walk 2,800 amas because he's saying, listen, I'm allowed to walk the diagonal of my square. So he was looking whether that would solve his problem. He should be able to walk from his holiday home to the minyan by virtue of the concept of the alachs. So he started measuring, and he wanted to know, he's not a Lubavitcher, he wanted to know where I got this concept from, that you can choose your own alachs. And I spent a lot of time with this person and looking, he sent me the map. And the problem is, even with the extra 800 amas with the alachsen, the problem is that he'd have to go down, as you can see, the road is kind of too far out. If it'd be a straight road, it would have been possible to work with the alachsen, possibly, but the fact is that he couldn't go in a straight line. So actually, though, he spent a lot of time, to his credit, and he found out that there is a farm somewhere in between where his holiday home is and the minyan, and he's planning to, I guess he's spoken to them, to the farm owners, the farmer, and he's going to put his box of matzah there at the farm, and that farm is within 2,000 amas from where he is, and then from the farm to the minyan, it's more than 2,000 amahs, but there he can use the benefit of the alachsen. So the point of the idea of Tchumen is that where your box of matzahs is, that's your residence. From there, you are allowed 2,000 in every direction. Plus, you can, once you've got every direction, then you can choose to, then you can take another, the diagonal of that square. So looking at the map here, 2,000 to the west, 2,000 to the south. Now, from his house to the, from the farmhouse to the shul is more than the Tchum Shabbos, as in 2,000 amahs, but by the benefit of alachsen, he's able to get there. If you look at the figures, he's put here that he's measuring 960 being 2,000 amahs, and then the diagonal here is 1050. That's over 2,000 amahs, but because of the benefit of alachsen, then that becomes legitimate. So it's a complicated thing, and I've spent a lot of time on it, but it's valuable to know. What's very helpful is when the customers are more educated, then you can get better solutions. Okay, now I'm looking here that someone on the previous point talking about Shemitah, whilst it says, like the comment reads the following: whilst no gzeira was made on fruit, probably others just more difficult to hide, nowadays surely fruit from Eretz Yisroel has the same status as sfichim. No, sorry, not at all. The difference is that vegetables need to be replanted every year. They don't grow by themselves, hardly. And therefore, the Chachamim made the Isser on sfichim because of the surreptitious replanting and claiming it grew by itself. Fruit of a tree grows year in, year out. Perhaps the quality may be slightly different because of pesticides, etc., but it grows year in, year out. You don't need to do malacha to have fruit growing year in, year out. So therefore, there's no need to apply the Isser of Sfichim to Pri Ha'etz. Let's move on. So that's about the Tchum Shabbos, and here is just one of the Achronim who says this point, and this is an interesting point, that whereas measuring the square for a city, so normally we would opt to use Ribuah Shel Olam, that the north would be the north of the world, and the east would, and therefore the alachsen would be a diagonal. It would be like northeast or southeast, etc. By contrast, for a yochid to choose which way, he can actually choose which way he wants his alachsen to be, and so he can choose his alachsen. Let's come back. If he wanted to use his alachsen from the farmhouse and to be able to go to where I'm pointing now, beyond that square, that would be legitimate. But then, once he chooses his alachsen in one direction, he loses the flexibility to go in other parts. Once you've chosen the extra 40% in that direction, so you've limited yourself in other parts of your freedom of movement, and that's we were looking at. Putting the Eruv on the side of the road somewhere halfway, and that didn't help because of not being able to stretch the alachsen in all different directions. You can only choose one direction of your alachsen. That's the point which is being said over here. Let's move on. Okay, some people have asked if someone does need to make Havdoloh during Tisha B'Av, does he make the brocho on Besomim? And the answer is no. You don't make the brocho on Besomim, just like the rest of us are not going to indulge in Besomim because it's it's an indulgence. So too, those who do have to make Havdoloh should not be making Havdoloh on should not be making a brocho on the Besomim. Now, about the psukim of Hinei Kel Shu'osi, this is interesting. Now, in the Welt minhag is that the psukim of Hinei Kel Shu'osi are not said on a Motzei Yom Tov. In Chabad, we do say those psukim, the Rebbe would make Havdoloh at the end of the Farbrengen on Motzei Yom Tov, and he would say Hey Nekel Shuosi. So that's no question that we say Nekel Shuosi, and these are brochos as we're going out from the Shabbos and also Yom Tov going out into the week. So we're saying there was a psukim of brocha. The question is about saying the brocha, the Nekel Shuosi on Tisha B'Av, or so then Motzei Tisha B'Av, yes, because again you're going out into the week, so you say the psukim brochas. But if a person making Havdoloh on Tisha B'Av, then now the Tisha B'Av says not to say those psukim. I would say that possibly that should apply even according to Minhag Chabad, because it's not like a Motzei Yom Tov. You're going. It is a time of where things are suppressed, and therefore perhaps the psukim shouldn't be said. Right. Someone asked, what should we use, a wine or dafka chamar medino? So although we don't drink wine during the 9 days, but if you need to for Havdoloh, we would make Havdoloh on wine during the 9 days. Some poskim say dafka to use chamar medino for Havdoloh if a person has to make Havdoloh on Tisha B'Av. Others say you can use wine. So generally, we have a rule that the sofek drabonon is the kula. Someone's saying he was instructed to use grape juice. Fine. Sofek drabonon the kula, and therefore, if you want to use wine, you could. If you wanted dafka to use chamar medino, well, make sure it's qualified as chamar medino. I saw somewhere about some using milk, and I really don't understand about how milk can qualify as chamar medino. It's a kind of, the chamar medino means the kind of drink which you'd invite someone over for a drink. So has a bit of chashivas. Let's move on. So a bit of a confusion here. There's a minhag in a Beis Ovel Rahman al that after Shachris and after Mincha or after Ma'ariv, depending on Ashkenaz or etc., to say a capital Tilim, to say capital Memtes. So now, where does this minhag come from? Before where the minhag come from, the question which came my way was, when it's a day when Tachanun is not said, particularly it was relevant to a Friday afternoon by Mincha. So some have a minhag of, instead of saying capital Memtes, to say capital Tes Zayin. And so what is the Chabad minhag on that? So now let's trace the minhag of saying capital Memtes. So what you have on the right of the screen is from what's called Be'er HaGoyla, from Rav Moshe Rivkes, and it's on the margin of the Shulchan Aruch. I think it's Siman Yerdeh Shin Tzadik Vav, I think it is. Now, so Shin Tzadik Gimel. And he writes the minhag Sfardim. The minhag Sfardim is to say a hashkaba, which is like Kilmod Rachamim, and they would say before Ma'ariv, and in the morning they would say capital Memtes and Tziduk Hadin. And that would be sort of after every tefillah, and that's an ancient minhag. Minhag atikin uvosikin. Where did it come? So this is the minhag Sfardim, as Rav Moshe Rivkes writes. Where does the capital Tes Zayin as an alternative come in? So I corresponded about this with Rabbi Lady Garelik, who's put out a madrich on Hilchos Avelos, and he does have some notes about this. Now, and he shared with me a letter which he received from someone called Rabbi Yaakov Chaviv, who lives in Eretz Yisroel, and he's done a big Talmud Chochem, has written a sefer on these inyonim of Avelos. And what he traces the history that Rav Moshe Rivkes lived in Vilna, but in the year Tov Tesvav, there was the Jewish community were exiled, were driven out of Vilna. At that time, he found his way to Rotterdam in Holland, and he spent some time with the Chacham Rabbi Yoshiyahu Paradu. And it looks like it was then that he picked up the Minhag Sfardim, and that's what he's writing here. Barisi Poi, he's living in Vilna. Where's the Sfardim in Vilna? This he wrote whilst he was living in Rotterdam. The Minhag Sfardim to say Kapitel Memtes. Now, you see here Kapitel Memtes and Tziduk Hadin are put together. Apparently, there's a difference between Sfardim and Ashkenazim about saying Tziduk Hadin on a day when Tachanun isn't said, where the Sfardim would say Tziduk Hadin regardless, and therefore they did not have any difference between yes Tachanun, no Tachanun. It would always be Kapitel Memtes and always have Tziduk Hadin. Ashkenazim don't say Tziduk Hadin on a day when Tachanun is not said. It looks like because of this, no Tziduk Hadin, then shouldn't take Kapitel Memtes. And so the earliest record we have of substituting Kapitel Tezayin for Kapitel Memtes seems to be about 80 years ago or something in the earliest record. I don't say it's the earliest it happened. And that is in the Sefer, the classic, kind of most modern, classic, but just before modern, is the Sefer Yesher HaChaim for Rav Tukachinsky. So he mentions this minhag, as a minhag in Shalayim, etc. Okay, so we have here a minhag of saying Kapitel Memtes. It is also in the Torah Orsidah, published by Rav David Lavut. So that was published in more than 120 years ago. So at the back, he adds Kapitel Memtes, which is said in the Beis Ovel, etc. It does not differentiate whether it's said on the day of Tachanun or not. Now, on the left of the screen, I've put here a note which I included in the Sefer Nesivim B'Snei Shlichus Chelik Beis. So that there we have that some have the minhag to substitute Tezayin, and then, however, there's a couple of sources, Chabad sources. Number one is during the when the Friedrich Rebbe was in Avelis, I think it's Tafshin Beis or Tafshin Gimel. So then the Rebbe makes a note that they said Kapitel Memtes also in the morning and in the at Mincha also on Friday, but not on Shabbos. In Tafshin Memches, it's noted here that they did not say Memtes on Friday afternoon. And then it's also noted elsewhere that in Tafshin Yud Beis, when the Rebbe was sitting Shiva for his brother, so again, they didn't say Kapitel Memtes. And the way it looks like is that this idea of substituting Tes Zayin for Memtes did not find its way into Minhag Chabad. So it's either Memtes, Tachanun or no Tachanun, but then we're seeing that on Friday afternoon, it isn't said at all. I'll know in the Tafshin, in the Rishimas Hayomen from Tafshin Gimel, it was said, but then we're seeing that by the Rebbe it wasn't said, and so, okay, that seems to be the bottom line, is on the Shvissen, not to say it at all. Now, Rabbi Garelik has some kind of theory why there should be a difference, why other days when Tachanun isn't said to say Memtes, and why Friday afternoon should be different, but okay, let's move on. So here I got a question also last Friday. A Yiddish boy is going off with some of his mates off to Holland for a holiday, and they are staying in Amsterdam in some hostel, and he wants to go to Shul on Shabbos morning. Beautiful. Happens to be there's a river between him and the Shul, the closest Shul, there's a river, and there's no bridge, but there is a ferry which is laid on free for tourists, etc. Doesn't cost anything. You just come along, go on the boat, and then go across the river. And he's asking the question, am I allowed to go to Shul with this ferry? Now, my first question in return was, who are these other lads who are going with him? Are they Yiddish boys? Are they Shomer Shabbos? And even if they were Jewish, apparently they were not Shomer Shabbos. So my tendency was here, let's get this Jewish boy away from those boys as much time as possible on Shabbos at least. So he'll do much less Chilul Shabbos by being away from them than being with them. So that was my motive here. But so there's two issues here. One is about motorized vehicles, etc. I don't know how the ferry works. Are you allowed to go onto a tram or etc.? But what really caught my attention is about not going onto a boat altogether on Shabbos. And here we have from Simulation. Now, this halacha is discussed in Reish Mem Ches and in Shin Lamed Tes, in two places, about going onto a boat on Shabbos. Now, this is an extension of the issue of swimming on Shabbos. That you're not allowed to swim on Shabbos in case you may come to make a float. So by extension, you're not allowed to go on a boat on Shabbos. So let's take a look here. We have a story in the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Tes about one of the Chachamim. He went on Shabbos afternoon. He went to the local river, and there was a ferry there, and he sat down in the ferry, and he fell asleep. And then an hour later, he wakes up, and he's on the other side of the river, and he got out of the boat, and then he checked out his orchard, and they asked him, "What's this going on the boat?" He says, "I was just dozing off. I was just sunbathing, whatever." And they told him, "No, that's too obvious. It's obviously that you are using the boat." So we see here that there is an issue of going onto a boat on Shabbos, and when a person, let's say, is on a cruise, etc., and they're traveling long distance, and the ship is leaving port on Shabbos. So the solution there is you go onto the boat Erev Shabbos, and you stay there for the onset of Shabbos, and then you can go back for the night, and then you go back in the morning, you go onto the boat, and then the boat goes on its merry way, and you join them. Now, so it looks like you shouldn't be going onto a boat on Shabbos. And so some poskim want to say that the need for the koine shvisa is because the ship is going beyond the Tchum. But the way the Alter Rebbe presents it over here is even if the boat is only traveling within the Tchum, you wouldn't be allowed to go on the boat on Shabbos, and unless you were there before Shabbos, which is not the case over here. So this was my problem. It was Erev Shabbos, and I was a little under pressure. And I said that there are poskim who permit it. And so here you have in the Sharet Shuvah, both in Siman Reish Mem Ches and in Siman Shin Lamed Tes, he brings poskim who allow you to use a ferry to go to join up the minyan. And it was quite a common thing in smaller places where they couldn't get a minyan together without people from the various villages, and sometimes needed a boat. And those places, some of them would actually be koine shvisa before Shabbos, and then they would come on Shabbos across with the boat. But then you can see here highlighted that the Shov Yaakov, who is a little bit before the Alter Rebbe, he writes that you can that even without koine shvisa, the koine shvisa is only for the Tchum. But as far as going to a boat and crossing with the ferry, if it's operated by goyim, that would be okay. And the Gemara says you wouldn't be allowed to go onto a boat. So he says that if it's for a tzorech mitzvah, that you would be allowed to. So here we have a heter. I don't know whether the Alter Rebbe would agree to the heter of tzorech mitzvah, but we do have a eminent poskim who allow the tzorech mitzvah to go onto a ferry. And so, as I said, I had here a motive to get this boy away from his not necessarily inspiring for Yerushalayim Chaverim, and to have him go to Shul. Now, let's just go to the next, before people come away and say, "Oh, the halacha was that you're allowed to go onto a ferry on Shabbos." Well, I just want to share with you from Piskei Teshuvos about generally using public transport. And it's far-fetched that another person is going to make the transport work that much harder. It's merely in a car, you take another passenger, so it's diverting the energy. Instead of moving faster, it's slowing down, and then the driver will press on the accelerator to go a bit faster. But with an electric, with a tram or an elevator, these things, you're not going to draw any more energy by having another person on. And yet, that's Mishum Zilzal B'Kedushas Shabbos. It is degrading for Shabbos to use any of these things, and therefore the consensus is not to use public transport, even for Tfilah Tzibur. And he says for people who are not frum yet and they are beginning to become frum, so then if they're using public transport, okay, one should be more tolerant. Just there's an issue of carrying the tickets, etc. I remember back in the 80s that in Russia, so in Moscow, there were many Baalei Tshuva, and there was no concept of a Jewish area. People were just plonked wherever the authorities decided to put them. And so some people were walking 2 hours or more from wherever they were to Shul. And here there was a difference between Chabad and the Litvische Baalei Tshuva, that the Litvische did allow them, at least on Yom Tov, to use the public transport, whereas in the Chabad Baalei Tshuvas were walking those long distances, even on Yom Tov, not to use the public transport. So there's no free ride to use the public transport on Shabbos or Yom Tov. As I say, in this circumstance, there was a special reason to be more lenient. What I meanwhile, I saw another interesting thing, that in this piece, he says it also talks about using lifts, which in America they call elevators, or escalators, not to use them on Shabbos. And even those ones which are made for Shabbos, they're made for people who are frail, etc. But for people who should, again, because of Zilzal Kedushas Shabbos, to avoid using the elevators. Yes, we know that elevators sometimes, where they go right now. Just someone made a comment about using milk for Havdoloh. The Rebbe has actually a comment in Igros Kodesh that not to rely on that. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this week someone consulted me. There's a couple. He wasn't Jewish and she is Jewish, and he's just gone through Giur and they're planning a wedding. And so now the question is, do you have a whole week of Sheva Brochos, or is it just the one day? So let's just scroll to the next slide. No, that's not here. Okay, sorry, to the left of the screen. So the halacha, as it is in Even Ezer Samach Beis, at Kama Mevorchim Brochos, they're talking about the Sheva Brochos, etc. If it's a widower who is marrying a widow, in other words, a second marriage of both of them, so the brocha is only said on the first day. If he is a bocher, although she is an almona, so for him it's the first wedding, for her it's not. Or if for him he's an almon, he's a widower, but she is a basula, so then one would have Shiva Simyamishta, one would have a full week of celebration. So in this case, they've been married before in a civil marriage. The details don't bother me. And so she is definitely not a basula. Now, the fact that he was married in the colloquial sense, but not in the halacha sense, does that make him a bocher, or do you say because he's a geyer and therefore he's like a bocher, or not? So this, someone had told them that they have 7 days Sheva Brochos, and I disagreed. And here I have a source from as a sefer, contemporary sefer, Kitzur Nachlas Shiva, and he quotes he writes a goy and a goya, and a non-Jewish couple who were megayer, it's only 1 day Sheva Brochos. And then you might have argued that perhaps because he never had a Jewish wedding, therefore he's called a bocher. But he quotes here from the Shevet HaLevi, from Rav Wosner of Rocha, that no, maximum it's just the 1 day, because he has been living a married life, and therefore it's only the 1 day. Rabbi Lou is making a comment here. I'm just going to read it. In USSR, I believe the non-Lubavitch allowed men to go to the metro on Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot for the mitzvahs which are Minat Torah. The Lubavitches stayed in Malachivka if they could, and if they couldn't, they would walk. Okay, thank you, Rabbi Lou, for that piece of history, which is, it's now Baruch Hashem, it's history. Let's move on. Right. So in this week's Rambam, in the three prokim, came up here the lotion that the Eidei Kiddushin at a wedding do not have to be designated. You don't have to tell them Atem Eidai. In other halachas, let's say if a person says, "Oh, I owe you, I confirm that I owe you £10,000," that might be just joking. And therefore, for that to be binding, he'd have to say to the witnesses, Atem Eidai, I'm appointing you as witnesses to my admission. Otherwise, it's just not taken seriously. So the Rambam is saying here that when it comes to Kiddushin, it's not necessary to designate their witnesses. If you see it, they're witnesses. It doesn't have to designate them. However, and that actually is brought in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Samach. Sorry, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Mem Beis, the dinim of Kiddushin. Samach Beis is Birchas Nesuin. Right. However, the second quote on this page is from Maram Mintz, Maram Mainz perhaps, and he has in Siman Kuftes a long tshuva going through step by step the procedure of a wedding and the ksuba, etc., and many details of what we do today by chuppahs are traced to this tshuva Maram Mintz. So what's normally done is by the chuppah, the Rov is the Gabbai will say, and the Rov will take the glass of wine, and he'll make the brocha very prihagofen, and then he will say the brocha sheket shonim b'tzveiso v'tzvona la'aroyes, the long brocha, and then the chos and kala are given a bit of wine to drink. So what he writes here, after he said the brocha, after the chos and kala have a drink, a sip, then he takes the Masada Kedushin takes the ring and shows it to the witnesses, and has the witnesses confirm that it's worth a pruta. And he says to the witnesses they should make sure to see how the chosen puts the ring on the kala's finger, and they should also hear the chosen saying Hareat Nekodeshesli, etc. The lower quote is from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Now, recently it was brought to my attention that in the Feldman edition of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, at the back there's about 8 pages which were added by Rav Feldman, was given from a grandson of Reb Shlomo Gransfried, who was Hayortza, was just this week. Reb Shlomo, so Shlomo Gransfried's grandson gave Reb David Feldman a kuntras of several pages, which should be added to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's only in that print. It's not in any other edition of the Kitzur for the moment. And it's very useful for Rabbonim who are Masada Kedushin. He's got a lot of very useful guidelines over there. And meanwhile, he says, again, the idea of saying to the Chos and Kala, these are the witnesses and none other. So just to point out the points which I'm saying, the Chiddush in the Maram Mintz is how after the brocha, only then does the Rov identify who the witnesses are. Normally we do that before. When the Rov is called up and before he makes the bracha, we already announced so and so are the witnesses, and then some have introduced a term, these are the ones and none other. These are the witnesses and none other. That wasn't the standard announcement in Chabad or many other Kehillas. But I'm just finding it interesting how Reb David Feldman also says, but this is not an announcement. This is saying to the Chos and Kala, these are the witnesses and none other. Now, why is it important to designate the witnesses, although the Rambam says it's not necessary? Well, typically, who's under the chuppah? Chos and Kala, parents, etc. There may be nearby, there may be family members. None of them are valid witnesses. And I could just tell you, standing under the chuppah many times, the photographers, here's the Masada Kedushin, move here, move there, you're blocking my camera. It's not so easy for the observers to see the chosen putting the ring on the kala's finger. Unless you tell them, come forward and see what's going on, most people don't see what's going on. And so that's not good enough. You need to have people to actually see. So yeah, sure, the Rambam says you don't need to designate them. If they saw it in passing, that's fine. But practically speaking, you do need to call them over so that there should be two kosher witnesses to see it. Okay, so it's not a machlokus with the Rambam, it's just a practical consideration. Right, let's move on. Okay, the last Shabbos I spent in Golders Green and walked over to Heichel Menachem, and Rabbi Gedalia Lieberman was giving a shiur about binyan bekalim, about opening containers, and unable to restrain myself, whatever, I shared with the people at the shiur a question about a fridge door which came off, a freezer actually. Now the freezer, the body of the freezer is made of metal, and you've got a hinge which is screwed into the top and screwed into the bottom, and then that's got a spindle, and the freezer door rotates on that spindle, which is supported by those screws. Happened to be, but my freezer, the bottom of the freezer had rusted to the point that the bottom hinge fell off. And there's a term in English called Murphy's Law, loosely translated in Yiddish as Havdoloh. This happened on Shabbos. And so I've got Shabbos, the freezer door has come off. Am I allowed to put that freezer door back onto it in position? Now, the freezer the door has a gusset, this rubber length all the way around the door. Inside that gusset, there is a magnetic strip, and that's what keeps the door closed. So really, you could just physically put the door in place. The magnet would hold it in place, and your food wouldn't get ruined. So how you like to do that on Shabbos? So after Halochos again, Rabbi Lieberman says that he also had the same thing a few years ago. The freezer door came off his hinges, and he had the same question and was struggling to find an answer. So let's look at the halacha. Now we have here a source in Shin Yud Gimel, Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Shin Yud Gimel Sifrit Zayin, talking about lids or doors of a piece of furniture. So the Mishnah talks about the lid of a box which has become detached from the box, from the chest. that lid is not muksa. So Sif Yud Zayin, the Alter Rebbe continues, that's all if it's from a portable piece of furniture. But if it's the door of something which is attached to the ground, whether it's a pit or something, a cupboard which is built in, he talks about here a chicken coop. So then you would not be allowed to take off the door, put it back. And because it's mechuber lekarka, because the door is attached to a building which is attached to the ground, therefore there is an issue of building and demolishing by taking away and putting back this door the other way around. And therefore he laments the fact that by big celebrations in summer, people sometimes lift off the windows of the hinges. With a goy doing so, that's also not allowed, because since removal of the windows is a chi of chatos, therefore, because it's so shamanas livnos, it's not as if you're demolishing for no purpose. You instead tend to put it back. Therefore, you wouldn't be allowed to even tell a goy to remove the windows from their door, from the window, for the window pane, whatever. It wouldn't matter from the the hole in the wall called the window. In the footnote, they have a reference there to simulation and tests, where here the Alter Rebbe seems to say a little different, where the Alter Rebbe says that putting back a door, I mean, Torah ain't Isur, putting back a door is not an Isur min HaTorah. If you put bricks is a Isur min HaTorah, but a door, it's not mamash the building, and therefore putting back a door is not Isur min HaTorah, it's Rabbanon. Possibly there's a difference between a window and a door, and that putting back a door being perhaps more portable, and therefore it's less an indigenous part of the building, and therefore removal of a door, putting it back is the Rabbanon. A window being more part of the wall, and therefore is a Issur min Torah, because otherwise you have a contradiction. Here it says a chiyuv chatos, and here he says it's Issur Rabbanon. Okay, so we have here removal of a door or putting back a door to a building. So it might be Issur min Torah, it might be Issur Rabbanon. Now, now we're talking about, we're not talking about a building, we're talking about a freezer, a freestanding freezer. If it's a built-in freezer, then it's kelim mechubar and a karka. But in Sifyud Ches, the Alter Rebbe says that if it's a large keli, that it's got a capacity of 40 sa'ah, which is an amah by 3 amahs, then it's considered like karka. Now, a typical fridge, 5 foot high, it's your shoulder height. It measures 60 by 60. So then it's got a shiur of 40 sa'ah, which is amah by 3 amahs. Now, before you start arguing, what about is the internal capacity? What is that 40 sa'ah? But here he says, im hadfanos, that the walls, the thickness of the walls also contribute. So we're talking about the external dimensions, not the internal capacity of the fridge or freezer. So a largish, medium to large fridge or freezer does have the shiur of 40 sa'ah, and therefore the door is considered a door of a building. And that makes it really, really a problem. So to put back the door onto the fridge or freezer would be a question of a chiyuv chatos. Now, according to what he says over there in Siman Reish Nun Tes, it still remains that he says Rabbanon to put back a door. I'm saying this, that you got these doors on spindles which you could lift off. Well, you're not allowed to lift them off on Shabbos or put them back on if it's part of a building. That comes into an issue of boiner. So now we're struggling now. What's the story with the freezer? One redeeming factor I would like to say is the following: that to fix a freezer is you need a screwdriver, perhaps some other tools. To use the gusset and the magnet to fix the freezer, that's not the normal way of fixing the freezer. It would be considered boine kilachayat. And here we have in Siman Shein Zayin in Seif Yud Beis. So let's read here. This is all we're talking about, asking a goy to do something, a halacha for you, if he does it in the normal way. If the goy does it in a not normal way, even if it is a shvus gamur, mutal yisasoy afilu al yedei Yisroel b'mokim tzar. That to do an even issur deraisa b'mokim tzar, you're allowed to. A yid is allowed to do this. Now, I've said this many times. For example, if a mokim tzar or a patient in hospital to walk past a sensor, which is going to open the door, etc. So if you do it kilachayad, that would be acceptable. So let's say if there is a sensor, you need to get into the ward or get out of the ward, whatever, to walk backwards. So you're activating the sensor. I know that. You do it kilachayad in a shloike derech hachoil, that is permitted b'mkoim tzar. Yesh oimrim shehu hadin b'mkoim hefsid. Some say that that's also permitted in the case of a loss. Yesh lismech al divreim b'mokim hefsid gadol. Where there's a significant loss, you can rely on that. And the reference to Shin Amud Vov is talking about a gutter which has become blocked with leaves. So how do you normally clear a gutter? Well, you use a plunger or something. And here, some Gemara in Ksubas about standing in the gutter with your foot and somehow pushing the leaves and releasing that the gutter should have the water be able to go through. So that otherwise the gutter is going to overflow, it's going to cause damage. So here we have b'mokim hefsid godel at least. So then we are permitted to do even a melacha deraisa kilachayad. Certainly, I suspect that this din of more than 40 sa'ah being considered a building, it's not so clear, and I would think even the machmirim, it's a din d'Rabbanon, And therefore, if it's a hefsed gadol, now this you have to assess. This you have to assess. You got now the freezer is now open. Is there a hefsed gadol by leaving it open? First of all, what are the contents? Are the contents perishable? If they're going to be defrost, it's going to be hefsed gadol. What I don't know, besides the contents, if you leave a freezer motor running and it's going to be left open, it might actually ruin the freezer, which for most of us would count as a hefsed gadol, although you might be welcoming the fact that it's got its merry way. If it's really rusted at the bottom, maybe time for replacement. But if it's really the bottom line here is, if to put back that door in its place with the magnets, if that is to protect you from a hefsed gadol, then I think we have a heter over here. As I said, from here, Simashi and Zayin. Let's move on to our next point. Right. So no, I'm just jumping ahead. 2 points here. Point 9 is on my list. Oh, before we go into point 9, someone asked me about fridge magnets. Very interesting. Whilst I was doing research about this fridge door, I saw this is one of the contemporary very good Sforim on Shabbos, is Orchis Shabbos, 3 volumes, and there he mentioned about a suction hook. Many people have got suction hooks for towels, etc. So he writes, if your hook is attached to a fridge, side of a fridge with a suction, that's called no different than if it was screwed in. It's called a binyan. So to put it back, to resuction it, if that's the right word, that wouldn't be allowed on Shabbos under the issur of boina. And then also the hook which fell off is muksa to the end of Shabbos. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. About someone asked about what's the story about Tisha B'Av in the Kviyas as it is this year, Yafech L'Simcha, and Tisha B'Av is actually on Shabbos, and the fast is deferred to Sunday. When do the restrictions on learning begin? Do they start on Friday afternoon because it's Ches Av already then, or is it on Shabbos morning, Shabbos afternoon, etc.? So there are different opinions, and certainly the majority of the poskim have no problem on the Friday afternoon. It's erev, so to speak, Tisha B'Av l'maisa. On Shabbos Tisha B'Av itself. So the Luach Koilo Chabad writes that said on Shabbos one should keep to learning Dvorim HaMatorah. So really, that's not such a big issue because we're nohig to learn Chassidus. We're nohig to learn even when one shouldn't be learning Dvorim HaMasamachim. The reason of this is it says to learn Sifrei Musar is allowed, and because it's kind of chastising the person, and therefore one would be allowed to learn Chassidus. Also, in the Luach Shiur for Rambam, the Rebbe addresses in such a kviyas. He says, when do you learn your shiur Rambam? So the Rebbe says you should ask a Rov. So this is once in every several years. There's a hero to ask a Rov a shaila. So all right. So the Rebbe didn't want to pass on himself, but l'chayre, since it's something which you do on a daily basis, the shiur Rambam has become a daily basis. So that yes, if there is a basis to be matir, a limud which is done on a daily basis should be allowed even in a time of grieving, and therefore that would be mutter. The chashash of Pikudei Hashem Yeshorim Mesamchei Lev, that you'll get very excited because you found something new in the Rambam, probably for most of us is not such a likely scenario, and therefore we can learn a shiur Rambam on Shabbos. Even on Shabbos afternoon. If you didn't manage in the morning, you can still do a shiur Rambam. And same thing with Chitas. If you didn't manage in the morning, you'll do it in the afternoon. You won't because you're Hafech L'Simcha, but fine. Then last week we'd been speaking about whether a woman should say the brocho Boirim Moira Ha'esh. So one of our listeners, someone whose name is Reb Level Wexler, who probably listens to the recording, he writes to me that he heard from Rabbi Chaikin, that he heard from Reb Zalman Teibel alav shalom. Reb Zalman Teibel had been present at Havdoloh in the house of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and Reb Zalman Teibel said that after the Rebbe made Havdoloh, the brocho hagofen on the wine, so that whoever it was, perhaps someone else was making Havdoloh, but then the Rebbe took the box of the Besomim and made a brocho and smelt it. Then he gave the box to his mother to smell the Besomim. And then the Rebbe made the brocho on the flame. But his mother did not make the brocho on the flame. And that I don't have any problem with that, because yes, throughout the year, regularly when men are making the brocha, it's not the minhag for women to put out their hands, and certainly not to make the brocha separately. Yotze with the Eish, they yotze by listening. Our scenario is talking about when a woman makes Havdoloh on her own, and there's no man present, then she would be making the Eish, and she would put out her hands to see her nails, as the minhag is for the brocha Eish. Finally, so I last week spoken about use of a goyrel, and I read this piece of Shulchan Aruch where it said, "Ein shoyalim b'choizim b'kechovim." You mustn't consult astrologers for advice. V'loy b'geirolis. You shouldn't be consulting casting lots. Now, I took the liberty of understanding this, of let's say to flip a coin and to say whether I'm going on holidays to Brighton or to Bournemouth, to make a decision by casting a lot. So one of our listeners, again, is on the recording. He says a very interesting story that Rabbi Weinberg alav shalom once spoke about. He was one of Lubavitch's most successful fundraisers, and he once told over one of his tricks of the trade, possibly even the name of the Rebbe, and that is, how much do you ask? When it comes to the ask, how much do you ask? So he says, I have in my pocket 3 pieces of paper. I'm guessing, the spectrum, how much is the least I should ask, the most I should ask, etc. And I put these 3 pieces of paper in my pocket, and then I take out a paper, and whatever it says on the paper, that's how much I can ask. So he was making basically a decision based upon a gyro. So yeah, very interesting. It's just my luck that on the anash.org, when they put they choose one juicy question, they put this as the advertising line for the shiur. They say, can you flip a coin and make a decision? I'm afraid I'm going to have to retract on that one. And here, having to revisit this, and here we have a tshuva from Reb Shloime Kluger. Now, I heard from my wife's uncle, Reb Mullah Azimov, B'Shem. He had heard the name of Reb David Haradoker, B'Shem the Rebbe Rashab, that about the Reb Shloime Kluger being one of the very reliable poskim. Shloime Kluger is sometimes quite radical in his interesting, innovative, and the Rebbe Rashab said so I call upon him here. He has the following. We'll give it a couple of minutes. I know we're running a bit late, but sometimes we finish early, so we'll finish a minute later. So here, to explain, how do you make a goyrel to choose who's going to have the Kaddish? We discussed this last week. And the Shach brings from the Tosfos, which is that you can't consult goyrolis. So he says what it means asking a goyrel means to divine the future. Like people ask an astrologer, what's going to happen? So also to use a goyrel to find out, is this person going to survive? Will I recover this lost item? So that is where you wouldn't be allowed to consult a goyrel to divine the future. And instead, you should rely on Hashem. But in order to toss up, to decide one way or the other, so he says that's definitely okay. And that doesn't have nothing to do with Tom and Tia. And he brings a proof from the fact that they would make the goyrolis in the Beis Hamikdash, who does which role. And we have in the Mishnah in Shabbos talking about casting lots, which child is going to get which piece of meat, etc. So you shouldn't be doing that, casting lots on Yom Tov. You shouldn't make a raffle on Yom Tov or Shabbos because of a kinyan, but otherwise you're allowed to make a cast lots who gets what. And then you have in this week, last week said, the Abishta wouldn't tell us to do a goyrol, which wasn't okay. Therefore, he says making a goyrol not a problem. Now, last week I differentiated between a goyrol to sort out between two people and a goyrol to decide your own course of action. Obviously, Rav Shlomo Kluger disagrees with that, and he understands that they both fall into the same category. It's using a goyrol to make what he basically is saying is, you need to make a decision now what to do. A or B, go this road, that road. For that, you can use a goyrol. If you want to use a goyrol, not for a course of action, but to find out information for the future, using the goyrol as a form of foretelling, that he says that would not be okay. So, all right. So now, can you flip a coin according to him and make a decision? Is it Brighton or Bournemouth? According to Rav Kluger, you are allowed to. And yes, al mil yismach. I wish you all a good evening and a good.
Dayan Raskin.
Yes.
Dov Geffen speaking. The potato thing, I understand, but it's not treif. Why kasher the pot?
Because it's a drabonon. Like if it were, let's say, if it were cholovakum, so you'd have to kasher it. So it's
cholovakum is cholovakum, but the potato is just a potato. You can't use it because it's schmidt or whatever.
Once it's got an isra drabonon, it becomes also. It's like that's I think. I might be wrong, but that's what my understanding is. Perhaps next week we'll revisit it. Okay. Good. Kol tov.
Well.
Tchum Shabbos.
Kol tov.
Oh, man.